Hello, this is Dr. Amanda from USCA's Writing Center. Today we're going to talk about citing literature in MLA. We'll be using MLA 8th edition. So when you write about literature, you're going to want to cite things. You actually have to cite the portion of the text that you're discussing. This is your evidence. It backs up your thesis and allows you to explain. So let's learn how to do it. Fiction, poetry, and drama all have slightly different requirements when it comes to citations, particularly when it comes to in-text citations. But once you get the basics down, it will be easier. Fiction seems like a good place to start, and titles seem like a good place to start as well. Format your title correctly. Short story titles are always in quotation marks. Novel-length works are always in italics. Titles, both short and long, get title case, which means that the first word and every important word in the title is capitalized. Here's an example. The Flowers is a short story by Alice Walker, and it's really short, only a page or two. That title gets put into quotation marks with the and flowers both capitalized. Alice Walker's novel, The Color Purple, gets italicized because it's a longer work and a stand-alone novel. We want to follow the same pattern in your essay and the works cited. So shorter works like short stories, poems, and one-act plays are individual texts, but they usually exist as part of a larger publication. The titles of shorter works are always put in quotation marks, and the titles of larger works or larger publications are always italicized. The same thing is true for a web page, which gets quotation marks because it's a smaller work, and a website, a larger publication containing many web pages. A website title gets italicized. A song is a smaller work, so an individual song would be put into quotation marks. An album, which is a larger collection of smaller works, individual songs, gets italicized. A show episode, a smaller work, gets put in quotation marks, while the name of a series, which is a larger collection of individual episodes, gets italicized. Again, most larger works are standalone. The novel The Color Purple is a book-length work. It's a big standalone thing. It's not part of a collection the way a short story might be. The movie The Color Purple is a full-length work as well. It's also a big standalone thing and is not part of a larger collection. When we deal with in-text citations, we need to think about the author's name and some sort of identifying factor for location. So MLA uses in-text citations. These are sometimes known as in-text parenthetical citations. This uses the author's name either in the sentence as an introductory phrase or in parentheses with page numbers. We need to do this for every sentence. Near the beginning of the story, the narrator, Mama, describes herself as, quote, a large big-boned woman with rough man-working hands. Walker, 370. This is from a short story by Alice Walker called Everyday Use. We know that this quote shows up on page 370 of whatever collection this short story is in. Notice that the period goes outside the parentheses. This indicates that the information in the parentheses belongs to that sentence. In this sentence, we don't use Alice Walker's name as an introductory phrase, but in the next sentence we do. Near the beginning of the story, Walker describes the narrator, Mama, as, quote, a large big-boned woman with rough man-working hands. 370. Notice that because we used Walker's name in the sentence, we don't have to use it in the parentheses. So using the author's name in the sentence as part of an introductory phrase is a really good idea. And I'd like to point out that if you mention an author's name, please use their last name. You're probably not best friends with them. There's some special rules for long quotes in MLA. Quotations of 4 lines or more should be indented from the rest of the text. No quotation marks are needed at this point. Instead, we rely on the indentations to signal that this is a quote. Page numbers and author's last name, if needed, are put in parentheses. Here's an example. Mama describes herself in vivid detail by stating that, colon, in real life, I am a large-boned woman with rough man-working hands. In the winter, I wear flannel nightgowns to bed and overalls during the day. I can kill and clean a hog as mercilessly as a man. My fat keeps me hot in 0 weather. I can work outside all day, breaking ice to get water for washing. I can eat pork liver cooled over the open fire minutes after it comes steaming from the hog. Walker's description of Mama as rough, masculine, and hard-working sets Mama up as a foil to Dee, her daughter, who is feminine and fashionable in a, quote, dress so loud, end quote, it hurts her mother's eyes. We can see that there are two ways to cite quotations in this. The longer quote gets indented. And notice that it's indented uniformly on the right. It also doesn't have quotation marks. So we're using that indentation, also known as a block quote, to indicate that this is one long quote. In the second sentence, we see a shorter citation. And because we used Walker's name there, we don't need to put her name inside the in-text citation. If you need to make a change to a quote to make it fit your sentence, there are ways to do that. You can use 3 spaced periods, also known as an ellipses, to show omissions from a quote. We use square brackets to insert our own explanations within quotations if needed as well. Look at this sentence. In everyday use, Alice Walker implies that Mama is a hard-working woman. Mama describes herself as, quote, big-boned, with rough, man-working hands capable of cleaning and killing a hog. Walker 370. You can see that the title of this short story is in title case with the E and the U capitalized. It's in quotation marks because it's a shorter work. When we look at the quote itself, Mama describes herself as big bone, ... I've cut out some information that wasn't necessary. I've also changed the tense of some verbs in the second half of that sentence, from clean and kill a hog to cleaning and killing a hog. The reason I've done that is because the rest of the verbs in this sentence, man working hands, start a pattern that I want to continue. It makes more sense in my own sentence, but I want to identify where I've made changes, so I put square brackets around them. All right, let's move on to poetry. Again, titles seem like a good place to start. We want to format our title correctly. Short poems are always in quotation marks, and long poems are always in italics. So the short poem design gets put into title case and in quotation marks. The short poem, When I Consider How My Life Is Spent, gets put into title case and quotation marks. Long poems like Paradise Lost, Beowulf, Canterbury Tales, and Inferno are stand-alone book-length poems. Most poems are going to be short poems, but long poems like these need the titles in italics. We want to follow the same pattern in our essays and in our works cited. Now, in-text citations for poetry is a little bit different. We want to use the author's name, either in the sentence or in a parentheses, but we also want to include line numbers instead of page numbers. The reason for that is that lines are important to poets and that most poems are actually fairly short. We use slashes, forward slashes if we want to get specific, for line breaks, and double slashes for stanza breaks in quotations of 3 lines or less. We want to give the line numbers in parentheses. So, in Adrienne Rich's Aunt Jennifer's Tigers, Rich says that, quote, Uncle's wedding band, / sits heavily upon Aunt Jennifer's hand, lines 7 to 8. The first time that you mention a poem, you want to make sure that you're including the word lines. After that, you can omit it. Notice that the second sentence in the example featuring Adrienne Rich's Aunt Jennifer's Tigers does not include the word line in the in-text citation after the quote. That's because this is the second instance of using this source. When I quote in that next sentence, Uncle's wedding band, which shows up on line 7, I don't need to put the word line number. Here are 2 examples from Wordsworth. Wordsworth writes that the world is too much with us / late and soon. This is from lines 1 and 2 of Wordsworth's work. The speaker states that, quote, the world is too much with us / late and soon. Because I haven't used Wordsworth's last name as part of the introduction to that sentence or somewhere in that sentence, I need to make sure that I'm using it inside the parenthetical citation. Again, this is lines 1 and 2 of a poem called The World is Too Much With Us. Notice that in the examples from Wordsworth, the first uses Wordsworth's name. He's the author, so he wrote the poem. The second example does not use Wordsworth's name in the sentence itself, so his name shows up in the in-text citation. But something else to notice is that the speaker states the quote. Please remember in poetry that the writer writes and the speaker says, speaks, states, explains any number of things. Don't confuse the writer and the speaker. They have different jobs and different roles in poems. The writer is never the speaker because the speaker is an artistic representation, like a character. Whenever possible, we want to introduce our source. That way we only have to cite line numbers. Alexander Pope's pastoral scene is marked by sorrow and depression, as though the spectator, who is asked to see, quote, the gloomy clouds obscure this cheerful day, end quote, is present at the funeral. Line 5. Pope's, quote, gloomy clouds, end quote, become symbolic of the internalized feelings of the speaker. 5. So, in the second sentence, we don't need to use the word line, and notice that we don't use the last name Pope in either of these in-text citations. We introduce his name in the source. And again, anytime you use an author's name, refer to them by the last name. There's some special rules for long quotes in poetry. Quotations of 4 lines or more should be indented from the rest of the text and appear exactly like it does in the original source. Again, no quotation marks are needed. The indentation shows us that this is a quote. We want to put line numbers and author's name, if needed, in parentheses. I'm nobody, who are you? Ends with a characteristically bittersweet stanza. How dreary to be somebody, how public like a frog, to tell your name the livelong June to an admiring bog. And this is from Emily Dickinson's poem, I'm Nobody, Who Are You? If we need to make a change to that quote to make it fit your sentence, we do the exact same thing we do with any other work. We use 3 spaced periods, also known as ellipses, to show omissions in the quote. And we use square brackets to insert our own explanations within quotations. So, in the Tintern Abbey lines, Wordsworth refers to a trance-like state in which the, quote, affections gently lead, ... him on. He is unquestionably describing the state of extreme relaxation, for he mentions that the, quote, motion of human blood was almost suspended. For example, his pulse slowed, and that in these states he considered himself to be a living soul. So there's a lot of quotes here. But what's going on in that last sentence? Well, the sentence contains quotes from 2 sections of the same poem. The first quote, where he mentions that the motion of the human blood was almost suspended, is from lines 44 to 47 of Tintern Abbey lines, and the second is from line 49 of Tintern Abbey lines. Because Wordsworth's name wasn't used in the sentence, it goes in the parenthetical in-text citation, and the lines used, 44 to 7 and 49, are separated by a comma. All right, it's drama. Titles seem like a good place to start again. We want to format that title correctly, which means using title case, capitalizing things correctly, and putting short plays or one-act plays in quotation marks, and long plays, plays with acts and maybe even scenes as well, in italics. In-text citations get a little bit tricky here. We have decisions to make. For short plays, use the author's name either in the sentence or in parentheses with page numbers, just like fiction. For long plays, use the author's name either in the sentence or in parentheses and provide act and scene numbers as well as page numbers. For long plays in verse, probably Shakespeare, use the author's name in the sentence or in parentheses with act, scene, and line numbers. So let's talk about in-text citations for short plays first. We want to use the author's name either in the sentence or in parentheses with page numbers, just like fiction. It's no different. So in Trifles, the county attorney is mistaken when he says, I guess they're not very dangerous things the ladies have picked out. Glaspell, 679. For long plays, we want to use the author's name, but we want to also use page numbers, followed by a semicolon, and act and scene numbers if needed. We want to make sure that we're defining what those things are. So at the end of A Doll's House, which is a full-length, long play, so it gets italicized, Helmer calls Nora a, quote, blind, senseless woman, end quote, for neglecting her, quote, sacred duties, quote, to her husband and children. And this is on page 28, but it's also Act 3 of the play. In-text citations for verse plays, we use the author's name in the sentence or parentheses with act, scene, and line numbers. And don't forget to use slashes for line breaks and double slashes for stanza breaks in quotations of 3 or less, exactly like a poem. The overall theme of Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, and that gets italicized because it's a full-length play, is best summed up by the words spoken by the character of Lysander in the first scene of the play. The course of true love never did run smooth. And this is Act 1, Scene 1, line 135. Separate those with periods. Whenever possible, introduce your source. That way you only have to cite page, act, scene, or line numbers. Here's some special rules for some long quotes. Quotations of 4 lines or more should be indented from the rest of the text and appear exactly as it does in the original source. No quotation marks are needed. Here's an example from Shakespeare's Othello. Othello too briefly doubts Iago's false claims about Desdemona's affair with Cassio when he states in Act 3 that, "By the world, I think my wife be honest, and I think she is not. I think thou art just, and think thou art not. I'll have some proof." But his doubts are laid to rest when Iago produces proof in the form of a bewitched handkerchief, which once belonged to Othello's mother. So, we take off the quotation marks, we indent it as a block quote, we make sure that we're citing act, scene, line. So this is Act 3, Scene 3, lines 399 to 403. And because we haven't used Shakespeare's name in the sentence introduction, we use it in that parenthetical citation. Again, if you need to make a change to that quote to make it fit your sentence, use those 3 spaced periods to show omissions, and use square brackets to insert your own explanations. Now we're at the dreaded Works Cited page. The truth of the matter is that Works Cited is actually pretty easy to understand once you understand the pattern. We always start with the author's last name and the author's first name. When you're dealing with literature, you usually only have one author, so that makes it easy. The title of a short story, short play, or poem gets put in quotation marks. Remember to skip this part for long poems, novels, and full-length plays. Next, we need the title of the place you found it. Now, if it's a short story, a short play, or short poem, it's an anthology, collection, journal, or website. But the title of the place you found it can be replaced with the actual title if this is a long poem, because it's not being found anywhere. It is a standalone thing. Next, you want to provide any additional information, like editors, edition numbers, volume and issue numbers if it's a journal, or edition type if it's an ebook. Now, most of the time, you're not going to have this information. Certainly, if you have a standalone, long piece of fiction, long book-length poem, or full-length play, you won't have as many of these extra things. But when you're dealing with short pieces, you may. The next thing we need is the publisher name, and then the date published. If it's a website, you're going to need a URL. If it's a shorter print work, you're going to need page numbers with the letter P or PP to indicate single page or several pages. Full-length works seldom need this because you're using the entire work. Works on websites seldom have page numbers as well, so skip this if necessary. If you're dealing with a website or an online article of some sort, make sure that you include accessed on, followed by the day, month, and year. Put that info in order. Last name, first name, smaller title, bigger title, extra info if needed. And for my example, I needed an edition and some editors. I need the publisher's name, the date, a web URL if it's appropriate, page numbers if that's appropriate, and if I have something I found on the web, I need accessed on day, month, year. So, Walker, Alice, everyday use, found in Backpack Literature, 5th edition, edited by X.J. Kennedy and Dana Gioia, Pearson, 2019, on pages 77 to 84. Those entries into alphabetical order, make them hanging indent, and ask yourself, what's the big deal? This is easy. If you need more information, Easy Writer is your best friend. So, many of you may have a copy of this. If not, right now, maybe a free copy online that you can access. Easy Writer will literally tell you how to create any citation you would ever want to create. It has color coding. If you need more information, please look in Easy Writer. Check out Purdue's online writing lab. Just Google Purdue OWL. Look at our library's research guide for literature or contact the Writing Center at writingroom@usca.edu. If you still feel like you need help, make an appointment with us. Tell us you're working on MLA style for whatever paper you're working on and we'll help you out. Thanks so much.